Understanding how long-term injured reserve works is like reading a legal brief. Alex Goligoski to LTIR will discuss what that means and what it allows the Wild to do on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duham, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. You can download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we'll discuss what exactly goes into placing a player on long-term injured reserve and why the number you think is not the actual number of salary cap space that the Wild have with Goligoski on long-term injured reserve. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and as many heard yesterday, Alex Goligoski put on long-term injured reserve for the Minnesota Wild, which means at minimum he will miss at least 10 games or 24 days of the season. And so where we have seen Jared Spurgeon, who is skating, albeit with skating coach Andy Ness, not necessarily with the team as of yet, he's skating. It means that Goligoski is going to be out a while. And the accounts of what happens, Goligoski was hit by a puck in practice, was later seen in a walking boot. So it could very likely be a while before we see Alex Goligoski again, which is why where Matt Dumba has not been, Jared Spurgeon has not been either. The Minnesota Wilds utilizing the services of long-term injured reserve in this instance. And let's just, before we dive into all the nuance, because there's a ton of nuance as to how this situation works. It's not simply place a player on long-term injured reserve and get that amount of money in cap relief. That's not how it works. But why have we seen this done with Goligoski as opposed to not with Matt Boldy and not with Jared Spurgeon? Well, for one, it allows the Wilds to call up Sammy Walker to fill that spot while also keeping Dakota Mermis on the roster for the duration of time that Jared Spurgeon is out. That's the piece of this too, is that the subsequent moves that will be made are pretty clear cut. Once Matt Boldy is eligible to return, Sammy Walker going to get sent back down. Once Jared Spurgeon is eligible to return to the lineup, we'll see Dakota Mermis sent down. And then at that point, the Wild may just for insurance keep somebody else on the roster, whether it be a 7th defenseman or a 13th forward. They will probably keep somebody up, because the other thing with long-term injured reserve is that the Wild will not be accumulating cap space for the duration of time that Goligoski is out. I don't know if this timetable is accurate, but I did see reported somewhere that it could be as much as 10 weeks for Goligoski that he'll be out, which means that he's going to be out well beyond the timetables for Jared Spurgeon and Matt Boldy. Michael Russo, who did a great job of trying to figure out exactly what goes into long-term injured reserve for The Athletic, mentioned that it's a 2 to 3 week timeline for Matt Boldy. So again, you're missing games, but you're not missing that required amount for long-term injured reserve. And the expectation then leads you to believe that it's going to be closer to 2 than it is to 3, because if it's 3 weeks, if it's any longer than that, then long-term injured reserve is probably the route to go. So short-term, what it means for the Wild is that Sammy Walker will be here until Matt Boldy's ready to return. It also means that we'll see likely Dakota Mermis with the Wild until Jared Spurgeon is able to return. So this allows the Wild some flexibility to have an additional piece on the roster without having to worry about those salary cap crunches that we've been under this season, will be under next season. And so it's some short-term relief. It's breathing room on the roster, but there's a lot more that goes into it than just that. And the other piece of this that I'll throw in is, I feel bad for Goligoski as well, because he's in a situation with this team where he's being probably asked to do a little too much, and now going to end up being on injured reserve for a while in what could be his final season. You don't want to see players have to deal with that sort of thing in what could likely be their final year in the NHL. It'd be nice to just be able to go out being a seventh defenseman for this team, as opposed to now having to be watching from up in the press box. But it is what it is. And so short-term relief in the immediate future for the Minnesota Wild, but it's not just $2 million flat. And so we're going to spend a good majority of the rest of the episode just dissecting all of the different routes and angles that go into placing a player on long-term injured reserve. That is coming up as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Yes, you heard me correctly. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Today's episode of Locked On Wild also brought to you by Game Time. And if you are somebody that loves to live life in the moment, then you have probably experienced the following like I have. Whether you are trying to find tickets for a sporting event the day of, you may find that prices are just outrageously expensive. Or, worst case, you go to the event after buying your tickets and you're sitting right behind a pillar and can't see any of the action. Game Time is here to erase all of that uncertainty by making buying tickets the easiest experience you'll have. Game Time offers all sorts of killer last-minute deals, plus views from your seats, as well as their best price guarantee. They take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you tune in for a special pregame preview edition, a bonus episode of Locked On Wild coming later today, taking a look at tonight's matchup against the Los Angeles Kings. We'll have a look at some of the stats as well as What needs to happen for the Minnesota Wild to beat the Kings here at XL Energy Center tonight? But first, we dive back into a look at long-term injured reserve, LTIR 101. And let's just start with the most important thing. Here's what you need to know about how long-term injured reserve works. The Minnesota Wilds don't simply get $2 million in relief because Alex Goligoski has been put on long-term injured reserve. But what it does offer is the ability for them to afford anybody on the Iowa Wild roster to call up for as long as Goligoski is out. Here's how this works. So a couple of key pieces to consider for the foreseeable future for long-term injured reserve. Number one, the Minnesota Wild, while Goligoski is on long-term injured reserve, will not accumulate cap space on a daily basis. And so this is why you see teams typically make a bunch of roster moves before they're going to put somebody on long-term injured reserve, because you're not going to accumulate any additional cap space for as long as that player is on the shelf. Also, the amount in which you get for the relief is determined by how close to the salary cap you actually are. So for a team like the Minnesota Wild, who are right up against it, 40-ish K, I think, is as close to the salary cap as they are. That comes out of the AAV from the player that you're putting on long-term injured reserve. So Goligoski's $2 million AAV minus the 40K that the Wild had in space before. So we're talking now about 1.95 million, right in that area. But that's not all. And again, that's why you see teams make moves before they place players on long-term injured reserve. Because if you have a ton of cap space, like let's say the Wild had let's just use Jared Spurgeon's contract, for example. Spurgeon makes I should have had this up. $7.575 million. Let's say they have $7 million in cap space. By putting Spurgeon on long-term injured reserve, you're only getting $500K in relief. So it's not like the AAV just directly comes out of the cap. It depends on how close you are to the actual salary cap, which makes a lot more sense when we consider how teams such as the Tampa Bay Lightning used the cap a couple years ago with Nikita Kucherov. Basically had him have surgery as the season was starting, put him on long-term injured reserve, gave him the entirety of the year to get back to playing shape. And then once the postseason starts, when the salary cap gets shut off, they just popped him right back on the roster. But that's not all. The long-term injured reserve essentially allows you to operate above the salary cap as well. And so when you put a player on long-term injured reserve, you can use that allotment for sure, but you have to then get back under the salary cap once that player is taken off of long-term injured reserve to avoid any sort of additional penalties. It's not only that, but we've got signing bonuses that are factored into this as well. And so it's not $1.95 million. It's actually less than that. As we look at Cap Friendly, there are two players on the Minnesota Wild roster who have signing or performance bonuses on their current contract. Sammy Walker, who has $57,500 in performance bonuses on his contract, and Marco Rossi, who has $850,000 in performance bonuses on his current salary. So what does that mean? that means that you take those performance bonuses and you put them into a separate category from the salary relief that you are going to get with a player on long-term injured reserve. Is everybody still with me? So what this means is that the Wilds take roughly $900K and put that into a separate category. So you have a little over $1 million to be able to use with the current long-term injured reserve formula. The bonuses, as far as I understand this, and I encourage, if I'm off on this after reading through Cap Friendly, after reading Russo's write-up about it, if I'm off on any of this, please correct me in the comments, because I'm not a cap expert. I'm not a lawyer, which it feels like you kind of need to be in order to understand how some of this stuff works. So you take the performance bonuses and you put those into a separate category, because if the player that you put on long-term injured reserve ends the season on that list, then those bonuses get applied to the following year's salary cap. And so $900K may not mean much for the Anaheim Ducks or the San Jose Sharks, but for the Minnesota Wild, that is essentially the difference between keeping a guy like Brandon Duhaime and not. So you put those aside and just kind of hold on to them. Now, the assumption is that Alex Goligoski is not going to finish the season on long-term injured reserve. This is something more along the lines of, I'll just use Gabriel Landeskog as an example. Obviously still on long-term injured reserve for the Colorado Avalanche. And so that's where that stuff starts to factor into play. And $1 million is not a whole lot to be able to do anything with. But for the Wilds, as mentioned, it allows you to dip into your prospect pool and call up some of those guys who make less than what you make less than $1 million. So Sammy Walker, obviously a good example there. You could, depending on if somebody else gets hurt while Goligoski's on long-term injured reserve, you could theoretically call Adam Beckman up to take a spot on the roster. So what this does is this allows the Wild the flexibility to call up who they need, which is something I find interesting, because that's something that Dean Evison addressed at the start of the season, is that this Iowa Wild team affords them a ton of different options to basically have somebody that you can call up to fill almost every spot, every line on the roster. You know, you've got, if you need somebody to fill in on the fourth line, you could go bring up Nick Patan. If you need somebody to replace Marcus Foligno, you could bring Jujhar Khaira onto the roster, Vinny Lettieri, Sammy Walker in this case. So it's not a lot, but what it is essentially is breathing room. And so when you start to factor all this stuff into play, rather than simply having to get under the cap before you pull a player off long-term injured reserve, it explains a little bit as to why the Minnesota Wild have not used it as much as I think a lot of us would have hoped that they would have over the past few seasons. And so it's a lot. That's the most I've read probably in a long while. Just trying to figure out what any of this means. And so hopefully that helps explain what we are dealing with here in Minnesota, and what can be expected for the Wilds as the season unfolds. Now, when Goligoski is ready to return, that's going to create an interesting potential hypothetical. And so we will finish today's episode of Locked on Wild by discussing that after this. All right, folks, the NHL season is underway and daily fantasy hockey is back. An opportunity for you to hit it big with Kirill Kaprizov going nuts, Connor McDavid, any of the usual suspects here throughout the season. And if you want to win 100 times your money, play daily fantasy hockey on the Sleeper app, the official app of Locked On NHL and daily fantasy partner for the entirety of the season. Sleeper is our top choice for daily fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy hockey. And it is so easy for you to win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. One of my favorite parts about Sleeper is that it is so simple. You can get your picks put together in under 60 seconds. All you have to do is select more or less with various stat categories, whether you think Kaprizov hits the over on shots or any of the other elite names throughout the NHL. Make sure that you use promo code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll also get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONNHL for up to a $100 match on your first deposit. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, we'll have a pregame preview episode for you coming later today, taking a look at the Los Angeles Kings and what the Minnesota Wild will need to do to come away with a win at XL Energy Center tonight. So when Alex Goligoski is eligible to return off of long-term injured reserve, don't we just go back to where we were with limited funds and inability to keep players up to help out the roster? Well, that's an interesting one because, you know, it has been a rough start to the season for Alex Goligoski, to say the least. And one of the other stipulations about long-term injured reserve is that there has to be legitimate injuries involved, and the NHL has the ability to review these cases to make sure that in this case you're not just stashing somebody on long-term injured reserve throughout the course of the regular season. And so for the Wild not only to not be bit next season with the performance bonuses, but they're going to have to bring him back at some point this season unless the Minnesota Wilds end up being a playoff team, in which you could, as far as I understand it, you could do what the Tampa Bay Lightning did with Nikita Kucherov to basically activate him once the postseason starts and add him back into the cap, because the salary cap does not exist for the postseason. So the Wild could go that route if indeed the injury is severe enough to where Goligoski misses or requires surgery. Let's say he requires some sort of surgery for whatever the injury is. Walking boot obviously leads you to believe it's a foot injury. Let's say there's some sort of a broken bone and there needs to be a surgery done to try to clean some of that up or correct it. The Wilds could just opt to, if they're not going to accumulate cap space while Goligoski's on long-term injured reserve, and you are not going to necessarily have to do anything with the roster beyond what you've already done, you could go that route and then add him in, and then you have the offseason to get yourself back to cap compliant without having to worry about adding those performance bonuses to next year's salary. That's the part that worries me the most, is that with now these extensions signed for guys like Matt Zuccarello, Ryan Hartman, Marcus Foligno, those kick in next season. And so you as a team are currently sitting for next season at a cap utilization of that's a question that of like 10 million. You've got a projected cap space of like $10 million for next season with Brandon Duhaime, a UFA, Sammy Walker, an RFA, Connor Dewar, an arbitration eligible RFA, Dakota Murmas, a UFA, Kalen Addison will be an RFA as well. So you've got some holes that will need to be filled. And so you do not want to have this carry over to next year's books, to say the least. But I'm just saying it could be a situation in which it takes a little longer than anticipated to heal up, and the Wild use that to give them breathing room for the rest of the season, to once Matt Boldy comes back and once Jared Spurgeon comes back, have some flexibility for call-ups the rest of the way as well. It's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out, because with all of these ramifications now for dealing with long-term injury reserve, now that we're finally here and have used it, there are ramifications either way for how this could play out as the rest of the season unfolds. So hopefully long-term injured reserve 101 was helpful here today. I know I learned a lot in researching, and appreciate listeners sending me materials to kind of help get more accustomed to how this process works. Some huge, great finds out there by the listeners. Appreciate getting all those as well. So we'll see what this means and how this impacts the Minnesota Wild as we move through the rest of the season. But for now, it allows them the opportunity to at least have some options if other players get hurt between now and the time that Boldy and Spurgeon return as well. That is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Now that you are finished with today's episode, again, we will have a pregame preview coming your way as well here a little later this afternoon. So make sure to be on the lookout for that, and then stick with us through the course of tonight's action. We'll have intermission reports for you as well. And don't miss our live Locked On Wild postcast after all the interviews and everything wrap up. After the game, we will break down all the action and anything we may have learned from what we hear after tonight's game. So make sure to join us for all of that. Make sure you subscribe if you have not already on YouTube or your favorite podcast platforms. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.